I'm now going to continue my video series on Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons by discussing 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. And I need to draw an illustration for you so you get an idea what was going on. In our modern day society, if you look across the United States, you know what you're going to see? Lots and lots of farms. And on many of these farms, you're going to find cows. Now, some of these cows produce milk. This is the very milk that we buy the gallons of milk and the pints of milk and the quarts of milk and chocolate milk and so on and so forth. All that comes from cows. Okay? And that's what we consume. Unfortunately, there are other cows that are raised by other farmers for the specific purpose of getting slaughtered. And once they are slaughtered, then a meat cutter comes around, cuts up the meat, and that's why you have your steaks and your bologna and your hot dogs and your hamburger and so on and so forth. Okay? Now then, in our modern day society, we probably will never meet the farmers who raise the cows. We probably also will never meet the meat cutters who cut up the meat so that we can serve it on our tables. We'll probably never meet those people. Let's contrast that with first century Judea. Okay. If you were living in first century Judea, you would have farmer A who would raise cows, who would slaughter cows, who would chop up cows and barter the meat. Then you'd have farmer B who would raise wheat and corn and soybeans. And farmer B would barter, he would barter his crops, his corn, his wheat, his soybeans, for the meat of farmer A. That was okay. That was kosher because both people believed in the one same true God. That was okay. Unfortunately, a lot of these Judeans, whether willingly or unwillingly, it didn't matter, they ended up migrating to Rome and Greece. So that meant that a lot of times they would end up being neighbors, with pagans. So you'd have this pagan farmer who would raise up cows, slaughter cows, and barter the meat. And this Jewish person would have absolutely nothing to do with this pagan. He wouldn't barter his crops for that guy's meat. Then Jesus showed up, and Jesus made a statement. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 15, verse 11. And what he was saying was, it's not what you put into your mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out of your mouth that defiles you. Well then, we fast forward to the book of Acts, and we have these new Christian converts at Corinth. Now, these new Christian converts at Corinth remembered that teaching. So you know what they were doing? They were going to the meat market where they knew that the people selling the meat were pagans. They knew that. They were buying meat from these pagan meat merchants and consuming meat that had been dedicated to idols. Well then you'd have other people that were really new to the Christian faith. They were seeing this, so these people were first saying, hey, you can't do that, you can't buy that meat because that's not kosher with Jesus. And these super Christians were saying, well, yes we can, we're not worshiping those idols, we had nothing to do with the dedication of that meat, so yeah, we can eat it all we want. And the new converts were like, well, I guess if he can do it. So then they would go to this pagan meat merchant. They'd buy his meat. And after a while, after they got to know this pagan meat merchant, then they would convert to the pagan faith of the meat merchant. And that was a problem. So Paul was like, whoa, 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 don't do that. So he was going to these super Christians. He was saying, look, you have two problems here. Number one, you're financially supporting a pagan. You're not supposed to do that. Jesus never said you were supposed to support pagan meat merchants. Then he said, on top of that, what you're doing is you're causing your new converts to end up getting converted to that pagan faith because they're getting to know a pagan meat merchant. And they're not supposed to do that either. Okay? It was one thing if you didn't know who was slicing up your meat or who had raised that cow. You can buy the meat all you want. But if you know that the person you're buying that meat from is a pagan and had already dedicated that meat to a pagan idol, don't touch it. Because you're causing newbie Christians to sin. And sin badly. Alright. So, now this kind of goes along the lines of what happened at one of the very first miracles of Jesus. You see this recorded in the Bible. One of the first things that Jesus did in his public ministry was he went to a wedding and he turned water into wine. And Jesus drank. So then you have newbie Christian converts that say, well, if Jesus drank, we can drink too. There was a big difference. Number one, Jesus wasn't drinking to get rid of any of his problems. He was drinking to celebrate a marital union. He was celebrating life. Secondly, Jesus did not get inebriated. He was not sloshed. He consumed a little alcohol, but he was not sloshed in the slightest. Think about this. Jesus consumed wine at the Last Supper. But Jesus was not inebriated when he left that Last Supper. He was fully aware of everything that was going on around him. No, he probably couldn't have passed a driver's test. Okay? He probably wouldn't have been sober enough to drive a car. But on the other hand, he wasn't to the point where he couldn't understand what was going on around him. He knew exactly what was getting ready to happen to him. And he wasn't using alcohol as an escape from the crucifixion that was going to occur. He faced that head on, perfectly sober. That's the difference. You see, when a lot of people go to bars, they're not going over there to celebrate a wonderful thing that's happened in their life. A wedding, or a future baby, or maybe a promotion at work or something like that. They're going over there to consume alcohol to drown away their problems. When you do that, you are sinning. When you go to a bar specifically to drown out your sorrows, no matter what they are, then you are sinning, according to Jesus. Jesus always faced his problems head on. And he wants Christians to do the same thing. Christians are to weather storms, not to ignore them. Storms are going to come. But Jesus said, I have overcome the world, and so should you. If you're going to follow the example of Jesus, you're to overcome the world, not drown away your sorrows. See what I mean? Okay? Now, God definitely tests your ability to love. Let me tell you something. It's one thing for a teenage boy to walk up to a teenage girl and say, hey, I love you. That's easy. Wait till the first storm comes. Wait till she has a real problem. And then you have to deal with it. Then we'll see how much you really love her. Or, same thing with a teenage gal. Let's say her boyfriend suddenly faces a real life problem. Maybe he's been accused of a crime he hasn't committed. That'll test her love for him. Are you going to stay loyal to him even though he's going through that difficult time? That's a test of love. God will test your love. If you don't pass it very well, there's a very small likelihood that God will allow you to go deeper into a relationship. It'll probably bust your relationship to pieces. And that's the same thing with a friendship as with a possible marriage. We'll see how much you care about your best friend when your best friend gets into a ton of trouble. Okay? Remember, Jesus didn't just sacrifice his life for all mankind. He also sacrificed his livelihood. Okay? Jesus, in the eyes of many men, not everybody, but in the eyes of many men, Jesus did not have a good reputation. Ask the Roman centurions. Ask the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. A lot of them really didn't think much of the reputation of Jesus. All they saw him as was some lowly poor person, a poor carpenter from Nazareth. Check it out. Especially when Jesus started sitting together with harlots and tax collectors and talking to them on a one-on-one basis. That didn't set well with a lot of people. Especially those extremely kosher Jewish people. See what I mean? So, Jesus wasn't rich. In the eyes of many, he didn't have a very good reputation either. So Jesus not only sacrificed his life for mankind, but he also sacrificed his livelihood. You see what I mean? So that's something else you need to remember. Now, how does mankind itself judge the worth of other people? Well, I'll tell you exactly how they judge it. They judge it by what kind of power a particular human being holds. I mean, if you don't believe me, take a look at the obituaries of the rich and famous and the obituaries of those who aren't so rich and famous. Shoot. You remember Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert? You should have seen the obituaries on both of them. Now think about the obituary of your neighbor. That's how mankind judges a man's worth. Or a woman's worth. Doesn't matter either way. Okay? Shoot. Mother Teresa got a bigger obituary than probably most of the neighbors around you. What did Mother Teresa ever do for you? What did your neighbors do for you? Think about it. It's not just neighbors. What about family members? I bet some of your family members got an obituary about this big. But Mother Teresa? Big. See what I mean? But you then have to ask the question. If you had gotten in real trouble, would you call Mother Teresa? Or would you call a family member? Or a best friend? That's the difference. Okay. Now let's contrast that with what God views in the line of a man's worth. Think about the people that God chose to lead the Jewish nation. Or look at who God chose to start the New Testament church. Let's go back to the Old Testament. Think about this for a second. God chose Noah. God chose Abraham. God chose David. The least likely person to lead the nation of the Israelites, God chose David. Think about that. In the New Testament, think about who God chose to set up the New Testament church. He chose Matthew, a tax collector. He chose Peter, a fisherman. Neither one of them had very good reputations, but he chose them anyway. And think about this. Who was Paul before he was converted by Jesus? Well, Paul was actually Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee of all things. Paul, when he was Saul, was part of a group of people that radically opposed Jesus Christ. So basically, if you want to think of it in basic terms, Jesus picked an enemy of himself to help set up the New Testament church. What a radical thought. So, the way God judges a man's worth and the way we judge a man's worth is two different things. Think about that for a second. Let that one sink in deeply. Are we or are we not Christians? Aren't we supposed to follow the example of Jesus? If we're to follow the example of Jesus, we should determine how God views the worth of men. Okay? We shouldn't go by what we think men are worth. We should go by what God thinks men are worth. And with that different of an attitude, we'll end up being better Christians. Well, that's a lot to think about. If you want to leave me some feedback, you can go ahead right down here below. I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.